Go ahead and tell me whether a private joke can destroy a marriage. Of course, I did not create that chat because I hated my husband. I created it because 6 men had spent years treating his silence like wisdom while I disappeared beside him. I only asked them to show him how he looked from the outside, and yes, some jokes went further than I planned. When he learned about it, he straightened his left cuff and became so calm that I took it for weakness. I was still certain the group would defend me when he finally demanded the truth. My name is Annika Hale. I was 38, and I coordinated community programs for the City Museum. My job was to take forgotten objects, give them the right light, and make people care. Of course, nobody thought that explained what I did to Jonah. They preferred the simpler version. Wife becomes cruel. Husband stays quiet. Friends choose a side. Our relationship was 9 years old, the marriage 7. Jonah was a municipal surveyor, the kind of man who checked a bridge twice and a birthday date once. He kept our car serviced, our bills early, and my phone charged. He also answered pain with a repaired shelf. That was the part people left out when they called him perfect. There had been real tenderness. Every first Sunday of the month, we printed 6 photographs and added them to the old green album his father had started. Jonah trusted me with that album after his father died. It held school pictures, camping trips, and the same 6 friends growing older around him. He said I understood how to preserve a life without making it look staged. At first, I loved that sentence. Later, it sounded like another task. My mother had once left my school award ceremony before my name was called because my older sister had a dance performance. 1 empty chair. 2 parents apologizing. 20 years of making sure rooms knew I had arrived. Of course, I did not explain life that way. I called myself social. Jonah never mocked that hunger. He simply treated it like another problem to manage. If I said a room ignored me, he offered to arrive earlier next time. He never understood that I wanted him to look proud while I was already there. The private chat began after Jonah left my museum fundraiser early to fix a water leak at Neil Mercer's house. His friends praised him for saving the floor. Nobody asked why his wife stood alone beside the donor wall. So I created Jonah, unfiltered. Neil joined first. Darius Cole came next, then Paul, Eric, Simon, and Wade. I told them the group was a harmless place to teach Jonah how other people saw him. Neil posted a picture of Jonah carrying folding chairs and called him the unpaid staff. Darius added a laughing face. I scanned an old album photo and gave it a new caption about Jonah being born 40 years old. 7 replies. 11 laughing icons. 1 wife finally visible. That evening, Jonah saw the green album beside my laptop and asked why 1 photograph was missing. I told him I needed it for a museum layout test. He studied my face, straightened his left cuff, and said he trusted me to put it back. Of course I heard surrender. I placed the photograph under my keyboard and opened the chat again. For the first month, the group stayed close enough to humor that I could defend it. Jonah wore the same grey coat to 3 dinners, so Neil started a poll about whether the coat had permanent ownership of him. Paul took a picture of Jonah checking the restaurant bill and asked if romance required a receipt. I posted the results after midnight when Jonah was asleep beside me with 1 hand open on the blanket. I did not think of the men as disloyal. They were giving me what Jonah did not. Attention. Reaction. Proof that I was not inventing the silence in my own house. Darius was the best at first. He had known Jonah since they were 12, and he understood exactly which habits would make the others laugh. He sent a voice note describing how Jonah once planned a camping weekend with a printed weather chart. I asked if Jonah had ever done anything without preparing for the worst. Darius answered that Jonah married me, so perhaps he had taken 1 risk. That line received 19 reactions. Of course it stung. I decided the sting made it honest. At home, Jonah kept trying in the only language he knew. He replaced the cracked lamp beside my reading chair. He put fuel in my car before a long museum trip. When I came home late, he left soup on the stove and a note with the heating time. I wanted him to ask why I was late. I wanted jealousy, curiosity, or 1 badly chosen question. Instead, I received instructions for soup. The group became my second room. When Jonah disappointed me, I carried the moment there. When he answered a story with a practical suggestion, I typed it out. When he went quiet during an argument, I asked the others to vote on how many minutes he could remain silent before becoming furniture. Neil always answered first. His laughter was loud because he was terrified of becoming the next target. I knew that about him. I used it anyway. Darius became slower. He stopped adding jokes and began asking whether Jonah knew about the group. I told him Jonah did not need access to every private space in my life. Darius reminded me that the space was built around Jonah. I replied that men had private chats about their wives all the time, and nobody called that betrayal. His reply came 10 minutes later. There was no joke beneath it and no promise to stay. That was my moral answer. Clean. Useful. Finished. The shift came during a volunteer setup at the Riverside Hall. Jonah was checking temporary railings before a public cleanup event. I stood near him with my phone recording because I was making a short museum video about community work. He explained that old site measurements were never perfect and that responsible people checked before they guessed. Later, I cut the recording after the word checked. The clip made it sound as if Jonah had said that site measurements were never perfect and responsible people guessed. I sent it to Jonah, unfiltered. Paul added text calling Jonah the city's safest guesser. Eric posted it to a neighborhood page. Neil said people should know how public money worked. I did not ask Eric to remove it. I wrote that a man who hated being misunderstood should learn to sound more interesting. The post traveled beyond the group. By lunch, it had been shared 34 times. Jonah's department received 2 calls. One came from a local contractor who had argued with him over a failed inspection. The other came from the volunteer coordinator, Helen Ward, who wanted the full recording. Jonah asked me that night whether my phone still held the original video. His voice was calm and specific. He said the public clip lasted 21 seconds, while Helen remembered speaking with him for almost 4 minutes. I asked why he was questioning me like a damaged bridge. He straightened his left cuff and asked who else had received my file. The exact length did not bother me. Municipal workers measured everything because numbers made them feel powerful. I told him the museum team had used several clips that day and that social media often shortened things. He asked whether I had shortened his words. What I heard was another practical man blaming his wife because strangers were rude online, so I gave him the answer he had earned. I said people believed the clip because it matched the way he presented himself. Careful, flat, forgettable. His fingers rested on the cuff for 1 extra second. Then he asked if forgettable was what I called him when he was not in the room. I laughed. A short laugh. Too quick. 4 days later, I gave the group its next assignment. Our community cleanup dinner was approaching, and Jonah would receive a service certificate. I asked each friend to send 1 line describing what Jonah contributed to the group. I said I would turn the lines into a surprise page for the Green Album. Paul wrote that Jonah carried problems other men were too interesting to notice. Simon called him reliable background noise. Neil suggested most useful when silent as a title. Darius wrote nothing. I messaged him privately and asked if guilt had made him boring. He replied that the edited recording had crossed a line. I told him the line only looked serious because Jonah worked for the city. Darius asked if I had sent Helen the original. I did not answer. The next morning, the group showed 6 members instead of 7. Darius had left. No speech. No accusation. Just a grey system notice under Neil's latest joke. I counted the remaining names twice and told myself 6 was still a crowd. That evening, Darius drove to Jonah's survey office with a thumb drive containing the complete export of Jonah, unfiltered. I did not see that meeting. What I saw was Jonah coming home after 9, placing his phone face down and smoothing his left cuff before he looked at me. He asked whether I had anything important to tell him. Of course I said no. I was already planning the album page for the cleanup dinner, and I needed the room laughing before Jonah could make 1 edited clip sound like a crime. The cleanup dinner took place in the old tram depot, a brick hall the city rented for volunteer events. Rain tapped the high windows. Wet coats hung near the entrance, and the room smelled of coffee, dust, and river mud. I had arranged the museum display along one wall, so people treated me like part of the organizing team, even though Helen was in charge. Jonah arrived alone. He wore the grey coat from the group poll. Neil saw it and looked down at his drink. Paul smiled. Eric touched his pocket where his phone waited. The group knew the plan, but their energy had changed since Darius left. That did not frighten me. It irritated me. People often became careful just before something became memorable. The official program was simple. Helen thanked the cleanup crews. A council member spoke about public spaces. Then Jonah received his service certificate for inspecting the old river steps without charging the volunteer fund. He walked to the front while people clapped. No grand smile. No false modesty. He accepted the paper, thanked Helen, and returned to his chair. That should have been the end. I stood before Helen could introduce the next volunteer. I said the friends at our table had prepared a more honest award for Jonah. A few people laughed because my tone told them laughter was expected. I carried the green album to the front and opened it to the page I had made. In the center was the missing photograph from his father's collection. Jonah was 17, thin and serious, holding 6 backpacks while his friends jumped from a dock behind him. Around it, I had placed the lines from the private chat. Reliable background noise. Born 40 years old. Most useful when silent. At the bottom, in my own museum lettering, I had written that every group needed a man who could carry the bags while everyone else made the memories. Neil laughed first. Paul followed. Eric lifted his phone. The council member gave one uncertain smile, then stopped when Helen did not join. I told the room Jonah had spent his whole life confusing usefulness with personality. I added that marriage had taught me the difference. The laughter thinned. Jonah did not look at me. He looked at the old photograph. His left hand moved to his cuff and smoothed it once. I knew that gesture. It meant he needed time to build an answer. I believed the room had finally moved faster than him. Then he did something small. He asked Helen whether the event camera had recorded the presentation. She said it had. He asked her to keep the original file with the rest of the volunteer records. No threat. No demand. Just a request made in front of the council member and the videographer. I told everyone that Jonah preserved paperwork when he could not preserve dignity. Eric laughed again, but nobody followed him. Helen took the album from my hands and returned it to Jonah. She did not congratulate me on the display. She told the room the next award was for the school volunteers. Her voice made my performance seem like an interruption rather than a gift. For 1 second, my fingers remained shaped around an album that was no longer there. Then I smiled and returned to the table. The dinner moved on, but the table did not recover. Neil asked about the weather. Paul went to get coffee and stayed near another group. Eric replayed his video without showing me the screen. 2 women from the museum team whispered beside the display. Of course, I assumed they were discussing the edited clip. Public work always created gossip. Jonah left the album closed beside his chair. He did not put it in his bag. He did not hide the page. He let it sit where every friend could see the old photograph and their own words around it. That was cruel in its own quiet way. He made their laughter look like evidence against them without saying a thing. After dessert, I found him in the tram depot corridor near a row of rusted route signs. The building was colder there. Rainwater had formed a dark line beneath the exit. He asked why I had needed strangers to laugh at him on a night meant to thank him. It was his quiet debrief, calm enough to make me sound loud before I spoke. I told him strangers had laughed because his friends knew the jokes were true. He asked whether Darius had helped write the page. I said Darius had become sensitive and left the group. Jonah repeated the last 2 words. The group. I watched his fingers move to his cuff. My mouth went dry, so I counted the route signs behind him. 4 blue, 2 red, 1 with the number scraped away. He asked what the group was called. There was an opening then. Small, but real. I could have said the name. I could have handed him my phone and let the ugly little room become visible. His face was not angry. It was tired. And for half a breath, I saw what the album page looked like without my explanation around it. Then Eric laughed in the main hall. The sound reached us through the door. I decided Jonah was testing me because Darius had shown him one message. One disloyal friend did not get to define 6 months of context. I told him there was no group he needed to worry about, only friends talking, which adults were allowed to do. He asked if adults were also allowed to edit recordings that affected someone's work. I told him he cared more about professional language than the woman standing in front of him. I said that was our whole marriage. He measured the damage to a clip, while I had spent years becoming background inside our home. That part was true enough to steady me. Jonah accepted the charge. He admitted he had stood beside me without being present and had confused providing with listening. His voice softened on the last word. I could have met him there. Instead, I told him an apology delivered after public embarrassment was only reputation control. He straightened his cuff again and walked back into the hall. By the time I returned to our table, Neil had gone. His wife, Amina, had taken her coat too. Paul said their daughter was sick, but he did not look at me when he said it. Eric still had the video on his phone. I asked him to post the award page beside it so people would understand the joke. He said he would think about it. Of course, that annoyed me. I took a photograph of the page myself and posted it to the neighborhood thread with a caption about honest marriage. Within an hour, Helen removed the museum tag. By morning, the city communications office had requested the original Tram Depot recording. Jonah placed the green album on the shelf in our study. The page remained open. I told myself he wanted me to see how wounded he was. His friends' partners were calling him only because he had made himself look injured. My sister Sabine called 2 days after the cleanup dinner. She had seen the photograph before Helen removed the museum tag. Sabine was never gentle with me, so I could not dismiss her like a stranger. She asked whether I had really used a picture from Jonah's father's album to make him look pathetic. I told her the picture already showed him carrying everyone's bags. I had only named the pattern. Sabine said I had not named a pattern. I had recruited a crowd. Of course, she chose the clean sentence. Sabine had always known how to sound moral after someone else made the room interesting. I asked if Jonah had called her. She said Amina had. That answer was worse. Amina was Neil's wife, not Jonah's sister, manager, or spokesperson. She had no reason to enter my marriage. Yet she had spoken with Jonah twice since the Tram Depot. Paul's partner had contacted him too. Eric's brother had asked for the unedited volunteer clip. People I had treated as background were building a conversation without me. That was the person I had not counted. Not one person, really. The partners. The people outside Jonah, unfiltered, who still had to live beside the men inside it. I called Neil. No answer. I sent 3 messages. He returned one line saying Amina needed space from the whole situation. 3 calls. 1 sentence. No joke. At the museum, Helen met me in the conservation room. The air there was dry and cool, and every object sat under soft grey cloth. She placed 2 printed frames from the volunteer video on the table. One showed Jonah speaking beside the railings. The other showed my phone raised toward him. Helen asked for the complete file from my device. I told her personal phones were outside museum policy. She reminded me that I had recorded under the museum program and posted with the museum tag. Her tone stayed neutral. Neutral people are difficult because they offer nothing to attack. I said Jonah had turned a marriage joke into a public dispute. Helen answered that Jonah had only requested the original records. Other people had supplied the explanations. Again, the room without me. When I came home, Jonah was in the study. The green album lay open on his desk, but the cruel page had been removed. He held it inside a clear museum sleeve I had once brought home for spare photographs. He asked me to sit. I remained standing. Jonah said he had read the group export from its first message to the last assignment. He named the group, the polls, the coat photograph, the furniture vote, and the instruction asking Eric to share the edited clip. He did not list them like accusations. He listed them like survey points along a boundary. My first thought was not shame. It was scale. Darius had not shown him one screenshot. He had shown him everything. I asked what Darius wanted in return. Jonah said Darius wanted to stop being the man he had become in that group. I told him guilt made cowards dramatic. Jonah smoothed his left cuff, then placed both hands on the desk. He said the photograph had been taken by his father on the last trip before the man became ill. Jonah had carried the bags because his father could not. None of the friends had known that. I had known. He reminded me that he told me the story when he gave me the album. The study lost its useful shapes for a moment. Desk, chair, lamp, album. All present, none available. I said I had forgotten that detail. Jonah answered that forgetting was not what the messages showed. The messages showed that I understood which parts of him were private, then supplied those parts to a crowd. He looked at the old photograph for a long time. There was real sadness in his face. No plan in it. No performance. He said he had believed those men would carry him if his marriage ever became too heavy. Instead, they had helped his wife measure how much shame he could hold. I moved toward him then. Not because I had accepted his version, but because touch had always ended arguments faster than language. I reached for his shoulder. I planned to soften my voice, tell him we had both been lonely, and pull him back into the role he understood. Jonah stepped away before my fingers reached his shirt. I held out my hand and asked him to take it. He refused to touch me. He said he could not separate my hand from the one that had typed instructions for his friends to humiliate him. His voice stayed low. His left cuff was already straight. That refusal struck harder than shouting. Even during our worst weeks, he had let me rest a hand on his back in bed. Now the space between us had a rule. Of course I called it punishment. I told him he was using physical distance to control the conversation. I said the group had grown because he refused to react to me in private. If he had looked at me, touched me, or fought for me, I would not have needed witnesses. He said his failures were real. He also said they did not type a single message for me. That was the first time my favorite explanation failed to move him. So I changed tactics. I offered to delete the group, attend counseling, and remove the neighborhood post if Jonah admitted at the next friend gathering that his coldness had caused the jokes. I called it shared responsibility. It was compromise arranged like a museum display, with my worst object kept out of the light. Jonah asked if I could tell the truth without making his pain pay rent for mine. I shut down the conversation. I said he was too angry to be fair, though he had not raised his voice once. That night, he slept in the study with the door locked. I watched the line of light beneath it until 1 in the morning. The group chat was almost silent. Paul had removed 2 old reactions. Eric deleted the neighborhood post, but the share count remained. Simon wrote that everyone should calm down. Wade left without a message. 5 names became 4. Near midnight, Amina sent me a copy of Neil's messages about the fake award. She said she had read them all. For a few seconds, the timing opened a door in my mind. Jonah had not been collecting allies. He had been returning each man's words to the person whose respect he feared losing. I closed that door by deciding wives always punished husbands through other wives. The next morning, Jonah left a printed invitation on the breakfast table. He was hosting a friendship dinner at the Riverside Rowing Club in 12 days. Partners were invited. Darius was invited. Helen was invited because the volunteer recording had become part of the conflict. I asked what he thought a party would fix. He straightened his cuff and said everyone deserved one room where the same story was heard at the same time. I read that as surrender. He still needed a room. Rooms were mine. The invitation changed the group. Paul asked whether anyone else had received one. Eric said Helen's name made the dinner sound official. Simon wanted to know how much Jonah knew. Neil read every message and answered none. I told them Jonah had seen the group and wanted to frighten us into apologizing. I said unity was our only safe response. If one person acted ashamed, Jonah would turn marriage humor into a campaign against us. That was how I kept them sensible. Shared exposure made people loyal. I proposed a warm roast at the rowing club. Nothing vicious, I said. Each person would tell one story showing that Jonah had always been too serious, too careful, or too willing to hide behind usefulness. We would laugh together. Jonah would either laugh too or reveal himself as the man who could not survive honesty. Paul sent a single thumbs up. Eric asked if phones would be allowed. Simon said his partner did not want him involved. Neil remained silent. Of course, I treated hesitation as fear of Jonah rather than fear of me. Helen removed me from 2 public programs during the video review. I told co-workers I had requested family time. 2 programs. 4 careful emails. 1 office door that now closed before people discussed the cleanup dinner. Sabine met me at a cafe across from the museum and asked me not to attend Jonah's dinner. She said an invitation was not always an offer of peace. I told her Jonah would not invite me if he planned to end the marriage. Practical men did not destroy their own schedules without trying one final repair. Sabine asked if I had apologized. I said I had offered counseling. She asked again. I stirred coffee I had not tasted and told her apologies were useless when both people caused the damage. Sabine left money under her cup and said she would not sit at another table where I turned cruelty into balance. That was her exit. Quiet. Expensive enough to cover both drinks. At home, Jonah packed his clothes from our bedroom in labelled storage boxes. Shirts, work gear, personal records. He did not pack the green album. It remained in the study. I asked whether the boxes were another performance for the dinner. Jonah said he needed our shared spaces to become clear. His hand moved to his cuff, but the fabric was already flat. I told him clarity had always been his excuse for coldness. Then I named the part of our marriage he had never challenged. He had given everyone his reliability and left me only his silence. He remembered road closures for Paul, tax dates for Neil, and his father's medical appointments for years. Yet when I said I was disappearing beside him, he offered a weekend calendar and a new lamp. Jonah looked down. He said I was right. No defense. No correction. For a few seconds, being right was not satisfying. It was only heavy. Then he said he had loved me through tasks because tasks were the only promises he trusted himself to keep. He understood now that this had made me lonely. He asked if I could admit that loneliness did not require an audience and that his friends had not joined the group by accident. It was his final offer. A clean place to stand without winning. I refused it. I told him a wife should not have to become cruel before her husband learned emotional language. I said his new honesty arrived only after other people saw him as weak. That meant the audience mattered to him too. Jonah answered that the dinner was not about saving his image. It was about ending 6 different private versions of the same betrayal. He picked up the box labelled personal records and carried it to the study. No more negotiation. The label faced the hallway like a small closed door. I reopened the green album after he left for work the next morning. The cruel page was still sealed in its clear sleeve. I photographed it and sent it to the remaining group members. I told them to prepare 1 sentence each for the dinner and to bring the old photographs Jonah hated most. Then I used the opening Jonah had left for me. I made a second edit of the volunteer recording. This version placed Paul's laughter after Jonah's comment about responsible people guessing. I added the album photograph at the end and a title saying that some men built careers from sounding certain. I sent the draft to Eric and asked him to hold it until my signal at the party. Eric replied that he did not want to post anything else. I reminded him that the first public upload came from his account. If he abandoned me now, Jonah would still have his name in the export. Eric sent no answer after that, but he did not leave the group. Shared exposure. Still working. 3 days before the dinner, Jonah asked whether I planned to bring the album. I said yes. He asked whether I needed the club projector. I studied his face for mockery and found none. He smoothed his cuff and said the projector would be useful because everyone should see the material clearly. To me, that was acceptance. I called it permission. The night before the party, I laid out a dark blue dress Jonah once liked and placed the album beside it. I wanted the room to see a wife arriving prepared, not a defendant being summoned. Of course, I still thought appearance could decide which facts mattered. I messaged Neil 1 final time and asked if he would open the roast. The message showed read at 10:14. No reply came. At the rowing club, The river pressed black against the windows. Jonah had arranged one long table beneath old wooden oars. Every invited partner had come except Amina. Neil's chair was empty too. Paul sat beside a wife who would not look at him. Eric kept his phone in his jacket. Simon and Wade took seats far from me, though Wade had already left the chat. Helen sat near the projector. Darius stood at the back with both hands around a paper envelope. I counted 19 people. More than I expected. Enough for a room. Jonah greeted me politely. He did not touch my arm, take my coat, or kiss my cheek. He only asked whether I had brought the album. I lifted it so everyone could see. Dinner moved slowly. Nobody drank much. I mistook restraint for Jonah's failure to warm the room. When the plates were cleared, I stood before he did and announced that friendship survived because honest people could laugh at themselves. My hand rested on the album. Eric's phone remained hidden. Paul stared at the table. Darius did not move. I said Jonah had spent years making silence look like character, and tonight his oldest friends would finally tell him what that silence cost everyone around him. Jonah straightened his left cuff. I smiled because the signal belonged to me. By the end of my presentation, Jonah would either laugh with us or prove my judgment of him correct. Jonah stood before I could open the album. He smoothed his left cuff, then smiled. It was not the thin expression I had called fear for months. It was the calm of a man who had finished waiting for other people to tell the truth. He asked Helen to start the projector. The first image was not my album page. It was the creation screen for Jonah, unfiltered. My name appeared beside owner. Beneath it sat the date, the member list, and my opening instruction asking his friends to help me show him what everyone really thought. My thumb stayed on the album latch. I pressed it twice, but the cover did not open. The screen moved through the clues already placed in front of me. The grey coat pole. The furniture vote. Darius asking whether Jonah knew. My 21-second edit beside the 4-minute original. Eric's public upload. The fake award page. My message telling the group to make Jonah's service dinner memorable. Then the second edit I had sent 3 days earlier appeared with its time and recipient list. Jonah explained that Darius had delivered the full export the night he left. Since then, Jonah had given each member's messages to the partner or family member whose trust mattered most to him. That was why Amina called Sabine. That was why Paul's wife sat with her hands folded away from his. That was why Wade had left before I knew the room was changing. The friends had not chosen Jonah. He had not chosen them. He had simply made sure nobody could hide inside my version or blame me for words they had typed themselves. Of course I called that an ambush. Paul tried to say the group had started as humor. His wife turned the screen toward the message where he suggested using Jonah's father's photograph. Paul stopped. Eric said I had pressured him to post the clip. Helen played his earlier voice note, offering to send it to 3 neighborhood pages. The excuse landed nowhere. I told Helen the edits were commentary and that everyone in public work understood context. She closed her laptop and said commentary did not require removing the sentence that proved the opposite claim. Her answer was neutral. Complete. I had nothing clean to attack. Darius placed his envelope beside Jonah. It contained his signed account and the original export record. He said he had laughed too long and left too late. Then he walked out of the club without asking anyone to forgive him. I looked toward Neil's empty chair. His name card was still there, but Amina had taken his messages home. Jonah said his attorney had filed the dissolution petition and would next serve a civil defamation complaint on me and the 3 men who distributed the edited recordings. I moved into a furnished room above a closed laundromat because Jonah would not share the house while the separation terms were arranged. Our joint account paid only household bills, and every personal expense came from the salary I was no longer sure I would keep. Paul, Eric, Simon, Wade, and Neil stopped speaking to one another after their families read the export. Darius gave his statement, changed his number, and never answered the one message I sent him. The museum placed me on leave while it reviewed my use of its program name and recording equipment. I had believed controlling the group made me impossible to ignore. It did. 19 people watched my name appear above every instruction. But attention was never loyalty, and editing a room did not make the people inside it mine. I had made Jonah the background of our circle until he removed the version of me holding the center. The green album sits on the only shelf in my rented room, open to the page Jonah stripped clean. The last page still holds 6 empty photo corners, and nobody has asked me to fill them.